So my plan is actually not to focus so much on aesthetics, but actually to juxtapose these social, political realms and artistic realms. So to rather focus on this context behind the mechanism of collectivism and collective accumulations. So I would like to juxtapose like two different mechanisms, but then again, of course, I'm aware that the difference is rather abstract or hypothetical or synthetic. But still, I will try to somehow map out my argument and to look at these different forms of collectivism and different forms of agency during this late Soviet socialist period in Latvia. So the one aspect or one component that I would like to start with is this social engineering experiment of creating a new human breed called Homo Sovieticus, and of course this was a synthetic construction in a sense that it's impossible, of course, to create a new human breed, but it was this kind of propagandic and a motivation, or I would rather say manipulative motivation to create a promise for a better future. And of course, this better future consists of a better society, and this better society is, of course, created by demolishing the previous one. But as we can see, of course, it's not like total demolishing, but appropriation of the previous, and then creating this kind of eclectic variant of a new form of ideals. And I will not go into depth with Homo Sovieticus, because obviously it's also very complex, and mostly this concept has been researched by Russian sociologists, and we cannot see it as applicable to all Soviet Union, because of course there is not just one Soviet Socialist Republic, and it's not like homogenic mass that we can discuss. So I will not go into depth, but what is interesting, it's interesting how this synthetic construction was functioning, and what kind of mechanism propelled this this construction. So on the one hand, we have this Homo Sovieticus, this new man, new Soviet man, which is optimistic, which is carrier of certain values and qualities and properties, and who is healthy, athletic, of course, heterosexual, optimistic, selfless, diligent, patriotic, who has Soviet rather than national identity, who also, of course, demonstrates obedience. So he is, and she is obedient and demonstrates, manifests this trust in the superior authorities and never questions, let's say, the commands or delegations given to him or her. What is important, so when we have these kind of synthetic ideals, of course it's also important to manifest them somehow in the public sphere. And these manifestations, of course, were very performative, and they took the form of demonstrations, and of course we know that these demonstrations were mandatory, which means that every now and then, whenever there was a particular date for the Soviet calendar to celebrate, there were mass demonstrations. And they, of course, had this kind of ceremonial, ritualized form. There were also constant reminders of the state control and state power, of ideology, and it was also a chance to build a certain narrative based on certain Soviet mythology. So this kind of performativity now we can observe in documentary evidence when we look at still and moving images of this performativity. But of course, yes, they were constructed as colossal, megalomaniac demonstrations, this kind of Gesamtkunstwerk, with thousands of people participating and showing this kind of passion for collectivism. But of course, we have to remember that this is not like genuine activism, although it looks like it's more like artificial activism really like created synthetically. But nevertheless, because it was mandatory, of course, it had this kind of mass impression that that it's somehow coming genuinely from the community itself. There were many symbols used, obviously, also like the cosmonaut, one of the, or the space explorer, of course, was one of the key symbols in these demonstrations, because it also stood for this kind of new ideology where religion was absent, and science, especially space exploration, was the sublimation for the non-existent religion, and Yuri Gagarin really epitomized this new man, this new Homo Sovieticus, so the best of the best. That was like an introduction to this social engineering experiment that took place ideologically, and we can also leave the question open to discuss how and whether we see the consequences now, and obviously we do see, because in the current geopolitical situation we are aware, yes, of different parallel segments of society, but we will not maybe go into that direction, but a look at the counterculture of Homo Sovieticus at the time. And counterculture, of course, was very bright and vivid and dynamic at the time. It was really like this creative youth coming from different disciplines. And of course, they wanted to distance themselves from this absurd reality of socialism. And what they did, of course, they tried to also artificially create some kind of islands of freedom, these micro environments where they could exercise more autonomous form of existence, and where they could share the knowledge, or where they could share their experiences. And so the first tiny clusters were these social clusters in cafes in Riga, and this was actually a meeting point for many like-minded people to meet. Also, we could see another community based around a subculture, which was the hippie subculture, which was booming at the time. And also we could see that these tiny everyday gestures also became like manifestations of a different identity. Although it was tiny, it was really like everyday, and not like massive Gesamtkunstwerk on the streets. But it is important that there were these manifestations, and even though they might seem trivial from the point of view of nowadays, even these different appearances and this boldness to look different and just walk down the street, the central street in Riga, which could result in arrest, must also be acknowledged as certain micro gestures. So here we see a photo by Mare Brašmane of hippie subculture, and in the center we see Andris Grīnbergs, who later became the pioneer performance artist in Latvia. Speaking about these transformations or performative qualities of visual identities, here is also a little bit like a kaleidoscopic view on especially Andris Grīnberg's changes, but of course transformations of appearances, but of course he's not the only one. So we could question whether we can see different kind of social engineering and different forms of collectivism, because obviously it's not only these everyday clusters that emerge, but also artistic clusters, artistic groups, which were fueled many times by common and shared interests in art. Or sometimes, of course, the interests they shared were not defined as art because they lacked the discourse. They very often they acted intuitively, which means that it was very often seen as a form of lifestyle or socialization, and not so much defined as art. But now, retrospectively, of course, we understand that what they did is something special in that particular context, even without the lack of the discourse and the knowledge. What these groups? There was several groups. Of course, they were non-official. They didn't have any official status, but they were defined by their common interests. And I will offer to look at two groups. So one of them is was formed around Imants Landsmanis, and the second French group, because there was also the first French group, which was heavily penalized by the system. But he became the director of the Rundala Palace, which you can still visit now. And what they did is actually they organized these carnivals. And again, we could argue that maybe carnivals, that's more like partying and socializing, that's not really art. But actually, we can see a lot of performative instruments that were used. And from the point of view of this social functioning and this kind of another form of collectivism, which was not part of the socialist collectivism, this is crucial, this is important, because what they did, they experienced different forms of management, different forms of coordination. So there was more horizontal power structure, and maybe not even a power structure. They could delegate each other, and they could act as a group without this vertical power hierarchy. So this is really important, and what is also important, that what they created was a non-object-based art. So what they created was actually a process to be experienced collectively by the group. So this is, again, I will question later how we can look at these processes from the point of view of nowadays, but it's important that art was sort of dematerialized, but what it resulted in was this collective experience. And then, of course, as art historians of today, we can, of course, examine this documentation and go into details, and like here we can see also appropriation of different media and so on. Yeah? So we could argue about performance as a medium. And another group, of course, was formed around Andris Greenbergs, who was a pioneer performance artist who really worked with the genre or the discipline. As a visual art discipline, and the group around him was not fixed. It was actually fluctuating, so it was open, and there were people coming and going, but of course there was like the core group around him. And he was also, he epitomized like a new kind of an artist producer, artist manager, which was not very common at the time when the art system was sort of maintained by the state and provided through this artist union. So, of course, this was also, we have to view these examples of art as marginal, peripheral, and this ghettoization of performance arts is still going on in Latvia. We are still struggling really hard to prove the legitimacy of the discipline. So it's also kind of paradoxical, but that's the situation today. So the question that we could ask, so what we see is maybe a different form of social design. Of course, the discourse of social design did not exist at the time. And I'm sure they were unaware of this kind of theoretical framework that could be applicable to the analysis of what they did. But what they created was, first of all, the processes. So it's not the object and not something to I don't know, to showcase in annual exhibitions or of course documentation did appear in exhibitions, but these process-based or event-based art cases did not. So what they did, they created this kind of alternative reality. These islands or these networks were not permitted by ideology and censorship. So, although tiny, still an opportunity to experience more authentic agency and more authentic form of individualism, which of course is abstract, because how can we define genuine authenticity? But this is in the context of this double life that many of them led. Of course, it is crucial that there are some instances in your life where you can feel authentic and real, and you do not have to pretend or wear a mask of Homo Sovieticus. publicus. So these microenvironments really really functioned as tiny islands of freedom, where democratic principles and participation, initiative, and non-hierarchical work relationships were implemented. So we could conclude or sum up that the totalitarian regime was somehow unable to paralyze this individual agency, but of course it would also be a generalization, because it is not like some kind of paradigmatic truth, but it is one kind of aspect or insight that it was actually possible, and that actually the political regime was somehow also stimulating this creativity of artists. Because if you want to distance yourself from the ideology, of course there will also be certain sacrifices that you will have to make, because you will be excluded, you will be marginal, and but then again, this was rather favored by the artists. And we could question whether these were not only innovative artistic strategies, but also social innovations at the time, because what is paradoxical, this was not underground, this was not something like really this existed in parallel. It existed in parallel with the official culture and official realm. So, of course, it is specific, historically, socially, politically specific, but somehow we also see that different forms of reality could and indeed did function and exist. Yeah, we could again leave this question rhetorical and open. So whether we can discuss these examples of social design and maybe cultural democratization, where this kind of grassroots initiative come from the community itself. We could also analyze the community building, which was not artificially oppressed and subjected and somehow ideologically created through this myth of sisterhood and brotherhood and etc. It was really like something like a genuine relationship that was cherished, and of course what we see is that they did create processes that impacted their social reality. Eventually, again, we could see chronologically that they were leading to a greater change in society. Later, we see manifestations of environmental and other gatherings and forms of activism. So I already see that I have exceeded time, but thank you so much for your patience and tolerating me. And let's discuss it later then in the panel discussion. Thank you so much.